Dennis crashed on the alien fucking planet, then accidentally conquered it. His busted drop pod hatch flew open as the human ex-marine scrambled out, coughing up crimson blood. His hard, combat-honed muscles and reflexes allowed him to avoid smashing his skull by throwing an arm up at the last second before impact. Dennis groaned, picking shrapnel from his shredded armor as the dogfight with the lizardly Chalnoth raiders still replayed in his head, despite his splitting headache and blurry vision. Fucking Scalies had driven him off course after a skirmish, forcing him to crash on this backwater primitive planet called Zorgax. He checked his holstered hand cannon and blade, verifying they were functional. Scanning the lush vegetation, Dennis spotted silhouettes of what looked like tribal aliens with primitive spears creeping towards his downed craft. The creatures were bipedal reptilians, wearing loincloths and carrying flint-tipped wooden shafts. His hand dropped to his weapon. With his ship destroyed, he'd need to secure shelter and resources on this hostile world, and these natives didn't look too friendly. But Dennis had faced rougher odds before as a hardened mercenary. He thumbed the safety on his gun and called out, "I come in peace, not looking for trouble, just passing through," Dennis yelled, not believing his own bullshit for a second. The tribals paused and looked at each other in confusion. A larger one, likely their leader, stepped forward and hissed something. No doubt they didn't speak universal common. Fucking perfect. Dennis was stranded on an uncharted world, surrounded by primitive lizards, with no way to even communicate. He'd need to get real creative, real fast, if he wanted to survive this mess. He slowly lowered his gun and made calming motions with his free hand, trying to show he meant no harm. The leader, wearing a skull headdress, cocked his head and chirped to his warriors. They lowered their spears slightly, but remained tense. Dennis took a deep breath. If these creatures had wanted him dead, they'd have chucked those spears already. Maybe he could reason with them, build an alliance, even temporarily, to avoid becoming lizard chow while he figured out his next move. Time to put those old Marine diplomatic training courses to use, and hope he didn't end up skewered or filling some alien cookpot by sundown. Dennis wiped sweat from his brow as he trained Ector's warriors in hand-to-hand combat. He taught them how to disarm opponents, exploit weaknesses, and fight dirty when needed. The reptilians were quick learners, adapting human techniques to their unique physiology. During a break, Ector pulled Dennis aside. "There is something you must see." He led Dennis into a network of caves beneath the planet's surface. As they ventured deeper, the caves opened up into a massive chamber. Dennis's jaw dropped. It was an abandoned Chalnoth armory, filled with advanced weapons, armor, and even a few small spacecraft. Dusty crates were stacked to the ceiling, filled with pulse rifles, plasma grenades, and powered exoskeletons. Ector explained that the Chalnoth had left this cache behind during a long-forgotten conflict, and his people had recently rediscovered it. Dennis ran his hands over the equipment, his mind racing with possibilities. This was a game-changer. With these weapons, they could even the odds against the technologically superior Chalnoth. He and Ector worked tirelessly to repair and modify the gear, adapting it for the reptilian warriors. They jury-rigged the powered armor to fit the tribesmen's frames and calibrated the energy weapons. As they worked, Dennis learned more about the Chalnoth's cruel oppression of Ector's people. The lizards spoke of forced labor, starvation, and mass executions, entire clutches of eggs smashed, hatchlings taken as slaves. Dennis's blood boiled with each story. He became determined to not only liberate Zorgax, but to strike a blow against the Chalnoth that would resonate across the galaxy. Weeks turned into months. The armed rebellion grew in strength and boldness. Strike teams targeted Chalnoth supply convoys and liberated slave camps, freed captives, swelled the ranks, and brought valuable intel. Dennis led daring raids on Chalnoth outposts, his armor painted with warrior tattoos. At first, the Chalnoth hadn't taken the uprising seriously, but as their losses mounted, they realized their mistake. Outraged, the overseers dispatched a heavily armed force to crush the resistance once and for all. Dropships darkened the skies as they disgorged troops and armored vehicles. Dennis stood with Ector and the rebel army, watching the Chalnoth forces amass on the horizon. The human checked his rifle and glanced at his reptilian comrades. They had come so far, learned so much, but it would all come down to this. This climactic battle would determine the fate of Zorgax and its people. Dennis raised his weapon and roared a battle cry. The Zorgax warriors answered with a hissing chorus of their own. Then they charged, racing across the barren landscape towards their hated enemy. Laser fire and artillery shells filled the air. The battle for Zorgax had begun. Laser bolts crisscrossed the battlefield as the Chalnoth dropships disgorged their troops. Commander Zorgon strode down the ramp of the lead craft, his plasma rifle held at the ready. Dennis crouched behind a boulder with Ektor and Raxa, watching the Chalnoth deployment through macro binoculars. Zorgon himself, Dennis muttered, recognizing the distinctive scars on the Chalnoth leader's face from intelligence reports. If we take him out, it'll cripple their command structure. Ektor hissed in agreement. What's the plan? Dennis outlined his scheme. The rebels would engage the Chalnoth head-on, drawing them into the dense jungle where they could use guerrilla tactics. Meanwhile, Dennis would lead a small team to infiltrate the command ship and plant explosives. They'd steal any data they could find before blowing the ship. As the Chalnoth troops marched forward, the rebels opened fire from concealed positions, energy weapons spitting blue bolts. Chalnoth soldiers fell, sizzling holes in their armor, but more kept coming, returning fire with a barrage of plasma grenades. Explosions shook the ground, vaporizing foliage and rebels alike. Dennis and his strike team crept aboard the command ship, silently dispatching sentries. They planted det charges in the engine room and downloaded data from the ship's computers. But as they made their escape, a Chalnoth sniper spotted them. The sniper fired, a crimson beam slicing through the air towards Dennis's unprotected back. But Raxa leapt into the line of fire, taking the shot meant for Dennis. The brave reptilian crumpled to the deck, a smoking hole in his chest. Raxa, no! Dennis cradled his friend, watching the light fade from Raxa's eyes. Grief and rage surged through him. He snatched up Raxa's weapon and charged down the corridor, cutting down Chalnoth troops in a berserk fury. Outside, the battle raged. Rebels and Chalnoth clashed in brutal close-quarters combat, while energy beams flashed overhead. Ektor rallied his troops, leading a desperate charge against the Chalnoth lines. It seemed hopeless. Suddenly, a barrage of missiles streaked from the sky, slamming into the Chalnoth ranks. A dozen heavily armed dropships descended from the clouds, human mercenaries rappelling out, guns blazing. At their head was Jack Reaver, Dennis's old comrade. "Looks like you could use a hand, Denny boy," Reaver called out, mowing down Chalnoth with his rotary blaster. Bolstered by the reinforcements, the rebels surged forward. Dennis burst from the command ship, just as the DT charges detonated, consuming the craft in a ball of plasma fire. The rebels let out a cheer as the ship crashed to the ground in pieces. Dennis and Reaver fought their way to where Commander Zorgon was rallying his beleaguered troops. The two humans engaged the Chalnoth leader in a furious melee, dodging his energy glaive. Finally, Dennis managed to disarm Zorgon, while Reaver stunned him with a neural disruptor. As the Chalnoth force surrendered, Dennis and Ektor clasped forearms, victorious but exhausted. Their celebration was cut short by a sudden transmission on the comms, a distress call from a human colony under Chalnoth attack. The battle for Zorgax was won, but the war was just beginning. Dennis and Jack pored over the captured data, searching for any weakness in the Chalnoth's defenses. The intel revealed the location of the besieged human colony, as well as the composition of the Chalnoth fleet bombarding it from orbit. "We'll need to hit them hard and fast," Dennis said, his eyes scanning the holographic display. "Take out their command ship and disrupt their coordination." Jack nodded, his scarred face grim. "I'll rally my mercs. We'll use the captured Chalnoth ships to get close, then board and sabotage them from within." Ektor hissed, his claws clicking on the deck. "My warriors will accompany you. We will show the Chalnoth the true strength of the Zorgax." As the strike force prepared to depart, Dennis pulled Ektor aside. "I need you to lead the ground assault. Those colonists won't stand a chance without support." The reptilian leader clasped Dennis's arm. "I will not fail you, my friend. The Chalnoth will learn to fear the name of Hector." The journey to the colony was tense, the strike force knowing every moment counted. As they dropped out of warp, the devastation came into view. The once thriving colony lay in ruins, its buildings shattered and burning. The Chalnoth fleet hung in orbit like a swarm of angry wasps, their ships pummeling the planet with plasma fire. "All right, you scaly bastards," Jack growled over the calm. "Let's show them what happens when they mess with humanity." The strike force split, the mercenary ships and captured Chalnoth vessels accelerating towards the enemy fleet, while Hector's dropships descended to the planet's surface. Dennis and Jack led the charge, their ships weaving through the Chalnoth's formation, drawing their fire. The space around the colony erupted into a maelstrom of laser fire and explosions. The human-reptilian ships danced around the Chalnoth vessels, strafing their hulls with energy weapons. The Chalnoth responded with a barrage of missiles and plasma torpedoes, the strike force barely evading the deadly projectiles. On the planet below, Hector's forces engaged the Chalnoth troops in fierce close-quarters combat. The reptilian warriors used their agility and camouflage abilities to outmaneuver the bulkier Chalnoth soldiers, striking from the shadows with lethal precision. As they pushed towards the ruined colony, Hector's scouts made a horrifying discovery. In a hidden lab, they found the remains of human and reptilian test subjects, their bodies twisted and augmented with Chalnoth technology. Data logs revealed the Chalnoth's sinister experiments to create hybrid supersoldiers. Hector's blood boiled with rage. He transmitted the evidence to Dennis and Jack, fueling their determination to stop the Chalnoth's atrocities. In orbit, Dennis and Jack fought their way to the Chalnoth flagship, breaching its hull with cutting lasers. As they stormed the bridge, they found themselves face to face with Admiral Zaxor, the mastermind behind the hybrid experiments. The Chalnoth admiral lunged at them with a plasma glaive, his movements a blur. Dennis and Jack met him head-on, their own weapons clashing against the admiral's blade. The bridge became a whirlwind of flashing steel and sparking energy, consoles shattering under the impact of bodies. With a final desperate blow, Dennis knocked the glaive from Zaxor's grip, while Jack stunned the admiral with a neural disruptor. The Chalnoth flagship was theirs. Seizing control of the ship's systems, Dennis broadcast a demand for surrender to the remaining Chalnoth vessels. One by one, the enemy ships powered down their weapons, realizing their flagship had fallen. On the planet's surface, Hector and his warriors liberated the surviving colonists, tending to their wounds and sharing the news of the Chalnoth's defeat. The colonists cheered, their hope restored by the arrival of their unexpected saviors. As the strike force regrouped in orbit, Dennis couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. They had struck a mighty blow against the Chalnoth, but he knew this was only the beginning. The intel they had gathered hinted at a far greater threat lurking in the depths of space. A threat that would require the combined might of humans and Zorgax to face. A threat that would test the very limits of their courage and resolve. But for now, they had earned a moment of victory, a moment to catch their breath before the next battle. Dennis looked out at the stars, wondering what challenges lay ahead. Whatever came, he knew one thing for certain. He would face it head-on, with his allies by his side, ready to fight for the freedom of all species, no matter the cost. As the battered strike force returned to Zorgax, they were greeted as saviors by the newly freed reptilian populace. Dennis, Jack, and Hector stepped off their ships to the sound of cheering crowds and chants of victory. The survivors of the colony they had rescued followed close behind, their haunted eyes slowly filling with hope as they took in the sight of their rescuers being celebrated as heroes. In the days that followed, the alliance between humans and Zorgax grew stronger than ever. Engineers and scientists from both races worked together to rebuild the war-torn planet, sharing knowledge and resources to create a new, shared home. Talk began to circulate of establishing a permanent human presence on Zorgax, a symbol of the unbreakable bond forged in the heat of battle. But even as they basked in the glow of victory, Dennis and his allies couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. They pored over the data they had stolen from the Chalnoth, trying to piece together the full scope of their enemy's plans. What they found sent a chill down their spines. The genetic experiments, the hybrid soldiers, it was all part of a larger scheme, orchestrated not just by the Chalnoth, but by shadowy human corporations operating in the depths of space. Dennis and Jack dug deeper, hacking into encrypted files and tracing financial trails until the truth lay bare before them. Their employers, the very people who had sent them to fight the Chalnoth, were among the conspirators. They had been funding the experiments, providing weapons and resources, all for the promise of exclusive rights to the spoils of war. Entire worlds would be stripped of their resources, their populations enslaved or experimented on, all to line the pockets of a few wealthy executives. As Dennis and Jack grappled with this sickening revelation, Hector made a discovery of his own. Some of his own people, seduced by Chalnoth promises of power and riches, had been collaborating with the enemy. They had sold out their own kind, even as Hector and his warriors bled and died to free them from oppression. The fragile trust that had bound the alliance began to fray. Suspicion and fear crept into the hearts of both humans and Zorgax as old prejudices and rivalries resurfaced. Fights began to break out in the streets as those who remained loyal to the cause clashed with those who sought to exploit the chaos for their own gain. Dennis, Jack and Hector found themselves caught in the middle, desperately trying to hold the alliance together, even as it threatened to tear itself apart. They fought not just against the remnants of the Chalnoth forces, but against the very people they had sworn to protect, former friends and allies turned bitter enemies. The final battle was brutal and bloody, fought not just on the streets of Zorgax but in the corridors of power and the depths of space. Dennis confronted the leaders of the corporate cabal, his eyes blazing with righteous fury as he demanded answers for their betrayal. Jack and Hector fought side by side, holding the line against waves of enemies, both alien and all too human. In the end, they emerged victorious, but at a terrible cost. The streets of Zorgax were littered with the bodies of fallen warriors, human and reptilian alike. The trust between the two races lay shattered, the once unbreakable bond reduced to a fragile thread. As the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Dennis, Jack and Hector went their separate ways, each grappling with the weight of what they had done and the knowledge of what they had lost. The war was over, but the fight for justice and freedom was far from finished. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.